We are back and with a very special guest. Her memoir, Going There, is causing quite the stir. It's available now, and I'm thrilled to welcome to Hysteria, albeit not on video, the one, the only Katie Couric.
Okay, Katie, when I sat down to read your book, after seeing the New York Post and the ladies on The View, I was convinced that by the time I was done, I was going to have to name this pod segment, Katie Couric is the fucking worst. But alas, I'm left wondering what all the drama was about when your excerpts were released. I have read the whole book. I mean, let me tell you something. There may be a couple petty sidebars, but on our podcast, we actually have a segment called I Feel Petty. So you talking about Jeff Zucker wearing Keds is not exactly right, in our opinion. Katie, why were people so crazy?
I made fun of him at the time and teased him about it. So yes. Why are people crazy? That's an excellent question.
Do you think it's because they don't read?
I think possibly they don't read. I think they're lazy. I think that tabloid media is desperate for clicks and salacious headlines. So it was actually fascinating on one level to watch disinformation in real time emerge from this book. I think that people want, I mean, look, you look at everything about social media now. You look at the fact that Facebook prioritizes the angry face emoji. Clearly there's this intersection of psychology and technology that is emerging and really kind of controlling a lot of media outlets. And then what's fascinating to me is that kind of the trashy tabloid press, which is very either agenda driven or needs clicks, as I said. So they're commercially driven, gets picked up by legitimate reporters who also haven't read my book. And then it just kind of cascades from there. So, what really matters to me now is that the book is out. People are reading it. They're responding to it. Most of them seem to be loving it. And, I think it's just kind of the media ecosystem we're living in right now. And I think, a lot of petty jealousy and resentment and all kinds of weird stuff emerges when someone who has been successful writes an open and honest account of their life. But it's been interesting, to say the least.
Well, and one of the things I would say, too, is that you're not harder on anybody in this book than you are on yourself. I mean, you talk real talk. And one of the things that I loved, your book resonated with me in 100 different ways. But one of the funny things about the reaction to the book is that one of the sort of themes in the book is how you really spent a lot of your career wanting to be liked. Right. Mm-hmm. And so one of my favorite quotes, which I have to read because when I read this, I just guffawed. And you write, "One morning when I was lying next to Jay in bed, I said the kind of thing you'd confess only to your closest friend. I used to want to be the most popular girl in school. Now I'm the most popular girl in the country. He turned to me, 'You're gross,' he said. Then he hit me with a pillow." So I love that because I care a lot about whether people like me. And this was all during your sort of like debut on the Today Show when you were the sunshiny queen of morning TV. I think you write, I'm paraphrasing, but you were this Gap clothing clad morning host. And if people felt like they had to dress up to watch Deborah Norville, with you, they felt like they could have eye crust and tea. And so at what point, which was me, I loved watching you and I did feel like you were so relatable. At what point did you come to terms with the fact that not everyone was going to like you?
God. Well, my husband would claim, Alyssa, that I still haven't come to terms with that, so it's sort of still a work in progress. I think that probably it's happened incrementally throughout my life. When you're judged on such a massive scale and the goal is mass popularity or palatability, is that even a word? I'm not sure. You kind of have to, I think, sublimate who you really are to a certain degree in order to achieve that. I think that as I got older and perhaps wiser and had strong opinions about certain things, I realized that I didn't necessarily fit into someone's perception of me or
Right.
into this tight box that was completely unoffensive, right? Because I think likability is synonymous with someone who isn't offensive, who's someone who doesn't stand for anything, who's someone,
Right.
someone who's such a blank canvas that people can project whatever it is they want to on that said individual. So I think I just started realizing as I got older, as I had certain opinions about, fairly contentious issues, whether it was gun violence and the need for stricter gun regulation, or, I'm a firm believer in abortion rights. I think I started realizing that in and of itself is pretty off-putting to a certain segment of the population. So I think it was sort of my my accepting and appreciation, honestly, for the fact that I did have strong opinions about certain things. And then, I think I write in the book about, went after my husband died and, I got a little more glamorous and I kind of deep six the Ann Taylor boxy suits, which by the way, coincided with, I think, a real shift in fashion in general. That people suddenly were like, wait, this isn't the girl next door. As I said, I went from the girl next door to the girlfriend next door. So I think I just think I slowly rejected this idea that people were going to, form their opinions about me. And it's at a certain point, Alyssa, I just didn't give a fuck.
Good for you.
And I thought about, we were laughing when Rebecca Traister wrote that article about me. I said, you should call it Katie Couric gives zero fucks. But that's not really true at this point, because I still do. I have to be honest, like some asshole tagged me on Instagram, and wrote to her 738 followers, trashing my book. And it was me, and all about her. And I'm like, it's a fucking memoir, lady.
Totally. But also, I love that you looked to see who this person was to see if you should really get that worked up about it.
Well, no, I just thought, wow, first of all, there's something a little sick about, okay, if she doesn't like my book, that's fine, whatever. As I said, it's not for everyone. I'm not for everyone. But to tag me, there's something slightly sadistic about that and weird. And I commented on it, which is unusual. Usually I have more self-restraint. And I think I said something like, I'm just happy that it is resonating with some people. And I'm thrilled it's number one on the New York Times bestseller list. But you're right. This may not be everyone's jam, because she said, it's your jam if you like Katie Couric. And I said, and that's perfectly fine. And
Did
then
she write you back?
I blocked her. Which is also a very passive aggressive move.
It's your form of therapy. You're like, I'm good now. I can move on.
Yeah,
But speaking, because you are a very funny person. And when I read through the book, I did notice that you deployed humor at certain, very strategic points, I think, throughout your career, which is something that I have personally written about and spoken about because I did it too. And I was curious, do you think that it's a tool that women employ to make men comfortable in our presence? That if we're funny and pithy, we're not too threatening, and we it. The humor makes the medicine, which would be our ideas, go down easier.
I haven't thought that deeply about it. I just think I'm kind of funny.
You are. Funny.
I think I have a good sense of humor. I think I can laugh at myself. I think I enjoy other people's humor. And, even the word deploy sounds like it was, that my humor is something that I very consciously, put out in the world at certain moments in order to get out of sticky situations. And honestly, I just don't even think it's that deep. I just think I'm kind of funny. I see the absurdity in certain situations. And I enjoy making myself laugh and making other people laugh. So, Perhaps, yes, to get to your original question, is it a device that sometimes women use? Maybe. I didn't use it that much in the workplace, sort of when I was doing, quote unquote, witty repartee on the Today Show, maybe. But
Right.
I think probably my shortcoming, if you could call it that, is I'm just a very direct person.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of say what I mean and I mean what I say. And I kind of try to keep, interact with people on an equal level. And I remember Jeff Zucker told me early in my career, when you say things, it really resonates, and you've got to be careful what you say. And I hated feeling so constrained by that. And by the way, it wouldn't be bitchy stuff. It would just be like conversation where you're trying to make a point, or you're talking directly about something, or how can we make it better? But this idea, especially, that powerful women have to walk around on eggshells, because if they say something that is just straightforward, it might be received in an exaggerated way or misconstrued. And I always thought that was really fucked up. I'm dropping the F-bomb a lot because I'm just super tired.
It's been a long book tour. You're allowed
I'd like to apologize in advance to any of your listeners who are offended.
Oh, no, Katie, you need not worry. Okay. We had an entire segment called Fuck That Guy. So you're in good company here.
Good.
You're in good company here.
But can I just say one thing? I'm just really glad, A, you read it, and B, that you don't think I am the worst.
No,
because, it took 3 years to write. It was, I think, it required a lot of deep thinking on my part. It required a lot of self-reflection. It required a lot of kind of unearthing all kinds of experiences that I've been through. And it really was written in a way that, I could be just honest with people. And I saw this thing on Instagram, Alyssa, that said, you don't like everyone, so why should everyone like you? So I gave my honest assessment. And for the most part, I think I was incredibly generous with almost everyone in the book, except for probably less than a handful of guys who really deserved it.
I agree entirely. And I thought that when I read through it, that it really was like a self-reflection, and that was like, and I like that because you are prolific. I have written 2 books. And when I wrote the first one, I literally had diarrhea for the entire, like when you send it, when you have the last set of edits that you send in and it's out of your hands and you're just like, oh my God, is everyone going to hate me? And it was really, when I went through it, I was like, is this a story that's mine to tell? Is it about me or is it about somebody else? And if it passed the test that it was about me, I'm like, I don't care if anyone doesn't like it because this is my story.
Right,
and I did have the same thing. I had a bunch of people who tagged me in their book reviews that were like this unserious person. And I was like, did you read the fucking book jacket? This was not an opus about my spot in history. This was like, how did I end up from some small town in upstate New York and like sitting next to the Oval Office? And it's like, if you can't get on board with that, then like, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, it's funny, you always think of the Man in the Arena speech by Teddy Roosevelt. And, it's just like you put yourself out there and you have to expect people to trash you, especially in this day and age. But listen, when all is said and done, I love this book I've written. My daughters consider it a gift. They both called me with full on ugly cries after they read the chapters about their dad. They, they respect kind of my honesty and the way I handled all kinds of situations where I was confronted by, the grossest kind of misogyny. And, and honestly, if somebody takes some meaning from this book about kind of persistence, about resilience, about keeping going, about still, having the capacity to find joy out of like seizing, totally seizing opportunities, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've achieved my goal. And I just think we live in a really weird time where people like to pile on. And again, I think it says a lot more about the culture than it would ever say about the fact that I wrote a memoir.
I have to say, when I got to, so I both read your book and listened to some chapters in the audiobook, because when I started reading the chapters that you wrote about your husband, Jay, I'm going to stop reading. So I have to listen to get through it because I wanted to actually hear you tell it. And I was full on ugly cry the entire time. But it was also such an important sort of, it's not a lesson, but it's an important thing that you say, that the whole time, here you were on television putting on a happy face. The minute the camera was off, you were literally psychotically tracking down doctors across the country to try to find ways to help him. And that ultimately, when it came close to the end of his life, you realized that he knew all along that this was not going to end well, but that he actually let you deal with his illness the way you needed to deal with it, which was by being so busy and trying to save everything. And I just, that's why I just loved I mean, I said it before, but I loved your book so much because I thought that was such an astute self-reflection, but also just like, it was a real gut punch, that part. But on to something lighter. I just have a question.
No, on a lighter note, as
on
a
a lighter note, Jesus Christ. I didn't, I specifically wasn't going to.
120 people were killed. On a lighter note, Thanksgiving desserts.
Going back to that, to the turkey recipe.
Yeah.
But I had made a conscious decision to not bring that part up because I thought I would even cry talking to you about it. But, so much of what you write is, it's like everything that people want in a memoir by someone like you. It's got the interviews and it's got the drama and it's got some wonderful things. And so I have a question. Was there ever a time when you were sitting down to interview someone and you sort of you had a line of questioning that you had set up, you had answers you thought they were going to give, but that it kind of like went off the rails and you had to sort of abandon your original plan and pivot on the spot?
A lot. I talk about the one where George Herbert Walker Bush came in unexpectedly after I was getting a tour of the White House from Barbara Bush, talking about the Dolly Madison tea set, et cetera, because it was the anniversary of the construction of the White House, and he popped in unexpectedly. So that was probably the most vivid time for me that I had to completely and suddenly change directions. I have to say in that interview, I did have Jeff Zucker in my ear because, I was thinking about that interview in the last couple of days, and I was so focused on learning everything in the White House and the provenance of all these antiques and paintings and the John Singer Sargent and yada, 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 that, it was during the Iran-Contra stuff, and it was, all kinds of things were happening in the world. And honestly, I wasn't prepared to do a full-on interview with the president of the United States. So Jeff was incredibly helpful because I thought I was going to run out of questions. I was just kind of stunned that he was suddenly in front of me, and Jeff was helping me kind of guide me with some suggestions in my ear, which was really, really helpful. But that, I think, is the probably the most memorable example of really having to pivot. But I think, that happens all the time where you have kind of a set of questions and you go off script because someone has said something interesting or provocative or surprising. So you have to just listen and then hopefully understand enough about the topic you're exploring with that individual that you can then turn and kind of go in a completely different direction. Now, that is a good question, in my opinion, but it's hard for me to think of really specific examples about it because it happens so often. And I think if you are a good interviewer, that ability to listen and process things in real time, and your willingness to kind of diverge from what was planned is really key, I think, to an interview that's much more illuminating than kind of going down a series of 8 or 9 questions.
Right. So we talked a little bit about it before, and especially when I read about some of the interviews you gave that in the end ended up being a little bit controversial, like when you interviewed Matthew Shepard's parents.
Right.
Matthew Shepard was a gay student at the University of Wyoming who had been beaten, tortured, and left to die back in 1998. And there was a reaction. Like, I think you're right that the minute that the interview finished airing, that the NBC switchboards were lighting up.
That was the governor of Wyoming.
Right.
So that was about the Matthew Shepard murder. It was just absolutely a horrendous story. And I asked the governor of Wyoming about conversion therapy, which I think actually was a pretty prescient question, because conversion therapy hadn't gotten a lot of attention. And I was asking him about if in fact, that might have set and created an atmosphere that was very homophobic. And I got James Dobson and the Focus on Family people just went ballistic on me, but that's an example of, when you do a show that is designed for mass consumption, you have to really tread carefully when it comes to asking really tough questions. I tried to do that. But I was also very mindful, and I include a lot of the viewers' responses when I did get tough, where in a way, and I think it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, it didn't fit into this box of this cheerful, relatable girl next door. And I think that's one of the themes that I talk about in the book. As a morning show person, you're supposed to have this certain patina. And yet when you're doing serious interviews about controversial subjects, and you do feel like there is a moral imperative to point out certain things,
right?
You risk alienating viewers. So especially if you're a woman, I think, Bryant could do it and be respected and considered like a tough interviewer. It was much trickier for me because I was sort of seen as the balm that soothed or kind of helped smooth over some of Bryant's rough edges. So, it's the whole thing is a very interesting thing about imagery and how you project, and misogyny and patriarchy and all those things that I think have put certain requirements on women, especially when they're public figures and when they are, well known. And then, of course, there's a second layer of that when they become successful. And so I think the whole thing is super interesting, almost from a sociological or perhaps even anthropological vantage point.
Do you think that now, so knowing that those kinds of interviews that you prepared for, the sort of outrage machine, for example, that the Shepard interview may have caused, the interview with the governor about Matthew Shepard may have caused, those were somewhat few and far between. If you were starting out now, would you have a hard time sort of quieting in your head when you're preparing with your questions to be like, I know I'm going to get ratioed on Twitter for this. I know I'm going to get dragged for this. Would that be hard to tune out?
Maybe, but I think, I was talking to Savannah Guthrie about this because she was part of my tour and we had a conversation in Philadelphia. And, she was saying that sort of all these reporters on Twitter, that it's not something that she feels comfortable with. All these reporters kind of giving their opinions and dragging other reporters and kind of, I think, being part of this media echo chamber where they're all trying to one up and impress each other instead of serve sort of the average information consumer. I would hope that I would put that aside, but I'm sure it would influence me to a certain degree.
It's an interesting question because when you think about it, during the Trump era, especially some of the reporters that you reference, it's like they actually became part of the story, which is kind of what I think you always try not to do.
Right.
And whether it was Trump attacking them and it turning into a viral moment and they get thousands of new followers, it was hard in some instances to take some of their reporting seriously because they were making themselves part of the story.
Right. Right. And I mean, I do think about journalists having to report during the era of Trump and how tricky it is, because we're not talking about two disparate political philosophies with people who believe in less government or people who believe in more government. We're talking about people who believe in institutions and the rule of law and people who don't. So,
right.
This whole idea of even kind of having the appearance of objectivity, which is a tricky notion in and of itself, is virtually impossible. And this whole bifurcated media environment that I think has been ushered in by the cult of Trump, or the sort of the Trump supporters, is really hard to navigate. I think if you're trying to replicate kind of traditional mainstream media sensibilities.
Right. Do you think that the 24/7, so when you first came on to the Today Show, it was 1991? Is that right? As a full anchor. So that's before the 24/7 news cycle really took hold.
I would say CNN was around, but it was before Twitter. It was before iPhones, which miraculously came about in 2008. It was before Instagram. It was before sort of all these social media outlets. And so, yes, it was such a different world. And, I've been working with this Aspen Commission on disinformation. And, one of the commissioners reminded us during some of our conversation, be careful to describe those as the good old days, because those were days where it was basically the purview of white men who were running all these organizations and companies. And a lot of people who didn't have a voice didn't have an outlet for those voices. So I want to be careful when I talk about that. But it really is interesting when you think about, I was just reading a Pew report, Alyssa, where many, many more people are now getting their news and information from their phones than television. I think it was like 50% from their phones, 35% from television, I believe. I'll have to go. You should look at this Pew survey because I think it just came out today. And it was just a very, very different world. And when you had so many people, I think, getting their news and information from one place, I think that quest to be palatable and inoffensive, and probably to pull your punches, was more pervasive than it is now. Somehow, I think, the balance is off now, but I'm not saying it was right before either.
One of my favorite chapters in the book was called The Booking Wars.
Oh my God, that was so fun to write.
It was, so for people, everyone who's listening should go get your book or listen to it. They should enjoy themselves because it's so enjoyable. But one of the things I thought was interesting is the booking wars, in this very online Zoom world now, I think that people don't totally appreciate what you had to go through to get guests on your show. And also, so could you talk a little bit about some of the hairy antics that you did to get guests on the show and what the wars were like, but also why it seems that it was only the women who were engaged in the booking wars?
I think that's a good question that I sort of attempt to answer, but to quickly explain to people who are listening. So back in the 90s and early 2000s, when there weren't a bazillion outlets for people, when they couldn't go direct to consumer and talk to their fans about something that they had done, or Chrissy Teigen couldn't write on Medium, what it meant to be canceled, or, there weren't a trillion podcasts and everybody had an Instagram account, et cetera, there were not that many places where people could tell their stories. And so if, Hugh Grant picked up a prostitute in California and he needed to kind of do a mea culpa, he would go on Jay Leno. And that was considered a huge get. I think the ratings were through the roof when Jay Leno famously asked Hugh Grant, "What the hell were you thinking?" So you had all these big news stories, especially in the 90s, whether it was Tanya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan, Lorena Bobbitt, cutting off John Bobbitt's penis and throwing it out the window, which actually was a serious domestic violence story that was later explored in a documentary. But back then it was just like, oh my God, can you believe this crazy story? And so getting these people to talk about what happened to them was a huge deal. It translated into promotion. It translated into ratings. It translated into, I think, for some of the female correspondents as, an atta girl or wow, she really delivered. And so your standing was enhanced in the organization. So for some reason, it was the women. It's interesting because I write about this, how the gatekeepers were often these male lawyers and the women, they didn't really prostitute themselves, but they definitely employed their feminine wiles. There was a very funny part when I talk about the lawyer for the caning victim, Michael Fay. And it was clear that these lawyers got off on all these women, calling them and, stroking their egos and trying to get their clients to go on television. And the lengths that the shows went to where someone would send a town car to the hotel and say, there's been a change of plans. You're actually supposed to go to Good Morning America before the Today Show. And I'm here to take you. And some of these people, honestly, were not that sophisticated. They hadn't really been on television before. They often, didn't live in big metropolitan areas. And they would say, okay. And it was just insane. People would sleep basically in front of people's hotel rooms to make sure the competition didn't somehow nab them. And I was talking to a friend of mine recently, I wish I had before I had written this book, where she told me about this doctor in Kentucky who was branding uteruses with UK for the University of Kentucky. I guess after he performed hysterectomies, one of his patients found out about it, went crazy, sued him, and she became this really big story. So my friend had booked her for Good Morning America. We found out, I called her personally and talked her into coming on the Today Show. She called my friend who was a booker and said, I'm sorry, I just talked to Katie Couric. I love her. I have a change of plans. My friend had to work all weekend, was totally freaked out, had to get Diane to call and get the interview back. P.S. The lady flies up. My friend takes her out to dinner. Then Diane goes to do a jailhouse interview with Scott Peterson. So she's not even on the show. So they couldn't let the woman they booked know that. They put her basically in a soundproof booth without any monitors. So they couldn't see she couldn't see all the promotions that Diane was interviewing Scott Peterson. And just my friend, I think probably, aged 15 years that weekend. But those were the kind of insane machinations that went on where, it was just, the competition was so ruthless and so insane, but in retrospect, so hilarious. And it was really fun to write about that because I think I said it was the last lurid gasp of the new millennium or something. And it was just also, all the stories were so tabloidy. I can't really do it justice talking about it, but if people read that chapter, I have to say that was one of the most fun chapters for me to write.
It was one of the most fun for me to read. So another thing that was important to me, and this is less of a question and more of a thank you, is that I have colon issues. I have gastrointestinal issues. And when I turned 40, 5 years ago, I had to get a colonoscopy. And I was so scared. And I remembered that on the Today Show, after your husband passed from colorectal cancer, you got a colonoscopy on TV. And when I was going to get my colonoscopy, I must have watched that segment 5 times because I was scared and I was like, it's fine. I'm going to be fine. Katie did it on TV. I'm going to be fine. And we're actually going to put that in our show notes for this episode because people have not been getting their mammograms and their colonoscopies because of COVID. And so if you need one and you haven't gotten one, please go get one.
And that's such an important point because you're right. A lot of people put off life-saving screening during the pandemic. And the figures are really scary about the number of people who may die because their cancers weren't detected at a point where they could really be cured. So I really appreciate you telling people that. And even like your younger listeners should make sure their parents get it or their, anybody over the age of 45, because they've lowered it, the American Cancer Society, because it's for some inexplicable reason, a lot more young people are being diagnosed with colorectal cancer in their 30s and early 40s. And so that's really important, but also they can talk to their doctor because one of the things I think there are other tests that you can do that are less expensive and maybe a little bit easier. And I'm not saying that to say, don't get a colonoscopy. If your insurance covers it and you feel like you have a good endoscopist who could do that, by all means, a screening colonoscopy at 45 is critically important, but there are also other tests and you can talk to your doctor about that as well.
It made me feel so safe, especially when I laid on the table and the doctor was like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "It's okay. I'm a little scared, but I know it's going to be fine."
Yeah. And also the drugs are really good. When I got
much
mine,
better.
I got mine, and the prep is better now too. When I
is.
did it, I drank, this huge gallon container of something that was so inappropriately called Go Lightly. And I was like, who the hell named this product? But now the prep is easier and the propofol gives you a really nice sleep. And when I got it, I wanted to be able to talk, and you can just totally be out and you wake up and it's done. And, it's just really important because if you have a polyp, that has the potential, as you know, to become cancerous. If it grows, it can penetrate through the colon wall, metastasize on other organs, as it did with Jay. When he was diagnosed, he had cancer all over his liver. Right. And so that's why it's really, really important. And, the University of Michigan showed that colonoscopies went up 20% after I did that, which
the Couric effect.
Yeah, I know, which is really incredible. And I'm not patting myself on the back, but what I'm saying is, those are a lot of people walking around today who wouldn't have been if they hadn't gotten screened. So, the real message is that screening saves lives and people need to do it.
Okay, Katie, last question. Question. It's a humdinger.
Oh, God.
But it's really not. So because it's Thanksgiving and you spent years as the dowager of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Not only that, I have several Emmys to prove that, Alyssa, for my incredible work at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
So all that said, do you have any particularly special memory of the parade?
Let's see. Well, I used to love doing it with Willard Scott because Willard was just so funny, but also kind of a little bit scatterbrained. And I used to have to hit him on his stomach to start talking because sometimes he would get so carried away and I would just smack him and he would start talking. So we had this very funny relationship when we did the parade together because it was just sort of a hot mess. But Carrie, my daughter, has it on her Insta bio that she was a proud participant on Hillary Duff's float. I think she played like a little baker when she was about 8 years old. So it was really fun when my kids, I think occasionally I would stick them on a float because they had to wait for me to be finished with the parade before we went anywhere for Thanksgiving. So that was fun. And then, there were always wind issues. And then, where Barney wasn't aloft enough. And I would, Barney was a big show. Was that a big show for you when you were a kid? Probably
No.
not. Yeah.
No.
It probably came about 15 years later. But I used to say, he's super duper. And, and then I always felt bad for the members of the dance troops who would have to do the splits when it was raining. I'd be like, that must be very uncomfortable.
Katie Couric, thank you for coming on Hysteria. Your new book, Going There, is out now and people should read it.